Hey Vikram, how are you doing?
Hey, Sebastian, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. I'm doing
Of
well.
course.
How are you?
Always a pleasure. Been wanting to get you on the pod for a long time. The one who's missing out is Eva. She's on holiday. I was on holiday last week. This week it's her turn. But yeah, I'll do my best to do her justice as well. And we have an exciting lineup. I want to say that we thought of this pod after we got the news that DAC Hubs is not dead after all. But there's a lot more that I want to talk to you about. You don't know all the topics, but I'll try to move us through a lot of stuff in 30
Great,
minutes.
great.
Um, but let's start with the kind of original topic. And what I was really keen to hear is what's the background story? Like how are DAC Hubs not dead?
It's a great question. So I assume the audience, because I know the podcasts that you record are quite attuned to CDR policy topics. So maybe I'll spare all the baselining, but just to make sure we're on the same page. Direct air capture hubs were a line item in the bipartisan infrastructure law enacted in 2021 or so, prior to the Inflation Reduction Act. There was $3.5 billion allocated for DAC, carbon management technologies of broad swaths and types, to really create these little clusters of innovation around the United States. So that way, if you could invest in, pre-feed and feed and design sprints on behalf of various technologies in different parts of the U.S., then maybe, just maybe, you anchor a little bit of U.S. government investment here, and some follow-on innovation will flow from there, like concentric circles. And we at Heirloom Carbon, alongside our peers at Climeworks, with our project partner Patel, were awarded a fairly sizable pot from that from that 3.5 billion, and it was about up to $600 million available for what is called a TA1 project, meaning a project that demonstrates a strong technological maturation and just execution ability. When President Trump came into office, we got a lot of different signals, Sebastian. And you can stop me at any point in time, but I do think that your audience will find this interesting. Executive orders started freezing various Biden-era spends, right? This hits right after the president's inaugurated and sworn in. But a couple of weeks later, April 20th, America honors Earth Day. And in the Earth Day statement, President Trump in this White House says, "We think carbon management technologies are great." I will spare you a Trump impersonation, but that's a bit of an odd signal, right? Because on the one hand, the new government comes in and says, we're going to review what the old government does. We're like, okay, fine. Earth Day message comes saying carbon management is critical to the modern way that we do business. You're like, okay, great. You feel some positive glimmers of hope. But what happened since then, and why I do think, it's important for this podcast and the CDR community to celebrate this as a moment in time, as sort of an inflection point, is that there was about a year and change, more than a year, maybe it's almost a year and a half of review of all kinds of projects, including carbon management projects from that $3.5 billion pot. And I don't want to mince words. Several projects got cut. So when we say DAC hubs are alive, there was definitely some rubble, that's left smoldering along the way. And in that graveyard,
Within DAC Hubs, you mean?
Within
As
DAC
well?
hubs, yes, that's right.
Okay, some
that's
of the
right.
other tiers, basically.
Other tiers, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In the lexicon of the framework, there were TA2s, TA3s. We were a TA3. But yeah, a lot of our peers in this space, a lot of players who are still alive and well, but also some that have been impacted along the way. So what we learned and why we actually feel like our protection of that $600 million was a big inflection point, not just for Heirloom or Climeworks, but for the industry, is that we were able to stitch together a durable coalition. And that durable coalition demonstrated to the federal government that irrespective of how you get into your persuasion or your conviction on carbon management, there are jobs and economic development interests for those that maybe are in the center and care about economic growth and manufacturing. There are environmental benefits and environmental attributes if you come at it from like the Biden era targets on net zero and trying to make sure you hit your IPCC goals. And there are also energy security, or, in Trump parlance, energy dominance interests for carbon management as it applies to enhanced oil recovery, liquefied natural gas exports, AI hyperscaling interests in local communities around the US. So I think what we did at Heirloom with several of our peers in the industry and key third-party conveners like the Carbon Business Council, the Carbon Removal Alliance, our colleagues at Climeworks, and so on, was stitch together a coalition that made the case to the Trump administration that, hey, you've got to think twice before canceling this, because it's not just what you think it is. It's not just a Biden-era green program. And as uncomfortable as that may seem to your listeners to say out loud, it's not really about being ideologically promiscuous with the person in power, but it is about persuading decision makers on the grounds that they feel most motivated to protect U.S. taxpayer dollars for.
But this is super interesting, and I've got a couple of follow-up questions. Maybe the first one is, at what level did this advocacy happen? Because you mentioned now these arguments that you made, and you mentioned that obviously you mentioned the Trump administration, but like, who did this coalition talk to make this case? And what was the most important part of that, I guess? Who made the difference?
While we are the spokesperson for this coalition or these arguments on your podcast today, we are hardly the sole voice that was effective here. So let me just say it took a village. But I think the most important place to start is thinking about where projects are built, right? And projects are built in local places, communities, neighborhoods. And that's where we started. So this planned investment, at least awarded in 2023 under President Biden, was contemplated for the state of Louisiana. Louisiana is in the Gulf Coast, or the Gulf of America, where enormous amount of energy is produced, developed, and exported, including into the European Union. And so talking to three different types of groups: economic development organizations, groups in the state of Louisiana that advocate for additional investment in the state. Two are workforce development organizations, those that can be clear that the skill set to be a plumber, a pipe fitter, an engineer, an electrician required to sort of build these carbon management facilities or DAC facilities actually have skills that are very transferable in and out of the energy majors, right? That workforce is a big deal. And I think it's important for us to recognize that some of these CDR jobs, not all of them, but some of them, are not about a long transition from one energy sector to another where individuals need to be skilled or reskilled or upskilled or go back to school. These are jobs they can do today. And I think talking to workforce development entities starts to pull in folks from different corridors that care about pocketbook issues. They care about the same affordability matters that several members of the European Union care about. And this is less about ideology and more just about being able to put your kid towards college. And then the third entity that we talked to, or category of folks, were those in positions of public trust. The governor of Louisiana, very different than where I am today from the governor of California, but a deep, deep conviction that energy in Louisiana and energy in the Gulf should be exported and be best in class for the rest of the world. So why not make sure that we're pulling down the best talent and the best investment to guide emissions management, to guide 21st century exports? So the governor himself, his cabinet, and several members of Congress and local elected officials, they all were also part of this cacophony of voices that spoke to stakeholders.
Interesting. No, super valuable lesson. And I guess you mentioned that some of the other tiers did not successfully replicate your effort, right? What do you think, what happened? Were they just too small to kind of matter for someone like a governor of a state, or what was the reason there, you think?
It's a great question. I think here's my diagnosis of the situation, right? First, I have to give a shout out to my colleagues at Heirloom, who, this doesn't just include people on our team, but it also includes an army of third-party consultants, lobbyists, supporters, investors, supporters of our company. We just had this unrelenting tenacity and patience, right? It's very easy, I think, and very valid for a company to take a look at a path to reaching FID, right? Stockholm Exergy did this brilliantly recently in the European Union by pulling in a bunch of different variables, taking a look at local incentives, taking a look at public policy, the level of debt and risk that their investors were willing to kind of apply towards different projects. All of that hits this magic FID moment, right? And when you have about a year and a half of delay of review from a federal government, that the investment certainty wavers and it slips. I think the first thing you have to do is applaud the Heirloom CEO and the Heirloom board for giving us on the policy team the runway to say, hey, this represents a significant amount of non-dilutive capital. That's the kind of thing that makes FID on our project all the more palatable because our economics on the project are that much better. Let's not go down without doing our level best to articulate why we think the United States should really care about this, right? So that takes patience. The second thing that it takes and why it might be different than some of the other players that were not able to protect their projects is, I think, something that Heirloom, and we have other peers who have done this too, right? So I can't take sole credit, but something that Heirloom pioneered, which is how do you talk to a totally different audience about the legitimacy and efficacy and the utility of this technology when net zero is not necessarily their North Star, when the IPCC report is not tattooed in their hearts and minds, and frankly, more recently, when the EPA, our EPA in the United States, has issued a declarative statement that carbon dioxide may not necessarily be a problem. That's a very, very hard persuasion exercise, but I think we rose to the occasion. And I would love your feedback on some of this, Sebastian, but the way we did that was think about what does the United States prioritize right now, right? The EU right now is going through a discussion and a rigorous debate on methane regulations. There have been previous laws set forth or discussions of laws around cross-border adjustment mechanisms. A lot of the idea that goods exported into the EU, one of the largest adopters and importers of American energy sources, needing to balance their emissions profile into the environment was a hugely effective argument. Because when you talk about Louisiana being home to lots of energy sources, it is home and boasts some of the most prominent LNG terminals in the world. Now, you and I can have a discussion, or my peers I used to work in the Obama administration, my Obama colleagues, Biden colleagues, Trump colleagues can all have a discussion on liquefied natural gas and its place in the overall path to hitting 1.5 or fighting to get to 2 degrees Celsius. And that's an important debate. I don't want to minimize that. But if we're just talking narrowly about protecting funding, you got to be willing to connect the dots and say, hey, Mr. Trump, if you'd like to be a great LNG exporter, then you've got to also think about carbon intensity requirements going into the import countries. Separately, what we did was, while we do not do this today, we have other recipients that are energy majors and recipients of the DAC hub money that, have explored enhanced oil recovery. And so just connecting the dots that CO2 pulled down through a DAC process could have other applications was useful. So in our case, we're not engaging in EOR, but we do have significant industrial investors that are our partners. Mitsubishi Ocean Liners, Japan Airlines, British Airways, United Airlines. They like to utilize our CO2 for various fuel applications. So that's another way to demonstrate to the United States that, okay, maybe you don't think about IPCC, maybe you don't think about net zero, but fuel manufacturing is important. So now you kind of start connecting the dots. Carbon management can facilitate LNG exports. It can facilitate more, sustainable fuels. It can also, for large hyperscalers, just this week, actually, I think within the last 48 hours, Meta announced that in Louisiana, it's expanding its footprint for one of the largest data centers on planet Earth as they think about the social license required to operate that. There are water issues, there are power issues, and yes, there are emissions issues. And so being able to name that carbon removal is a part of their calculus, just like Anthropic just bought into Frontier's most recent Advanced Market Commitment Fund 2, it starts to demonstrate a logic to the Trump administration or any government that you can be energy dominant, you can produce new fuels here in the U.S., but you can do so utilizing the prowess of a direct air capture technology. And I think either because we had the patience and leadership and kindness from our leadership, or because we were just ruthless in wanting to make sure we connected these arguments to the administration. Somewhere in there was a little bit of a new metabolism of what this tech is. And it wasn't just your Biden era's carbon.
Yeah. Let's shift gears because there's a lot of other stuff I want to talk to you about. You already mentioned the EPA. I want to talk about 45Q, because obviously 45Q, after the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, was kind of solidified in many ways, right? Before, people were a bit uncertain, but then clearly it persisted and is there. But then, I mean, from talking to folks in the US, there are some challenges with it from a reporting perspective, but I think that's something that not many people understand in our audience. At least I was really not aware of. So can you explain kind of what's happening with 45Q right now? How does it affect you? What does the future look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so for everyone's awareness, when we say that when we in the policy community describe the importance for demand side policy, I do think that there are different ways to do it. We're very excited about the prospect of the ETS integrating carbon removal as a way for covered entities to manage various costs and to spur demand for technologies like ours. But we also do not sleep on it. Doesn't matter who's in the Oval Office. We do not sleep on the fact that there's up to $180 a ton under 45Q for taking CO2 out of the air and sequestering it permanently, as Heirloom and our peers in the space do. When the EPA advanced a basic missive around greenhouse gas reporting requirements, it sort of shook up the center of gravity, in part of 45Q, center of gravity of 45Q, in part because the entire premise of receiving those $180 per ton is based off of a reporting framework or reporting structure. I want to give huge credit to the Carbon Capture Coalition, our peers in DC, as well as our peers who are no stranger to you, Sebastian, at Oxy and Carbon Engineering, because they've done a lot of pioneering work on coming up with a new vision for this Department of Treasury to work with the EPA to account for what a new framework could look like in light of this new rule coming out of the EPA. And so I won't pretend to be as literate in the framework that they have written, but what I can tell you are two things. One, 45Q remains one of the best production tax credit frameworks in the planet that can help continue to show that project economics are strong, that projects can hit FID, and I think the BBB, the Big Beautiful Bill, not only protecting it, but enhancing its credit value by bringing along other forms of CO2 management, just demonstrates that this is core scaffolding of the carbon management framework globally, certainly within the United States. The second thing it does, and then I'll shut up, Sebastian, is I think this period where the reporting is a little uncertain because of these new rules that need to get ironed out across Treasury and the EPA, it demonstrates one thing that in America we know all too well right now, which is public policy within our democracy is quite fragile, and it requires a constant investment in the durability of coalitions. And I think that's the through line between the DAC Hub project work that we mentioned a few moments ago and the 45Q dynamics, which is, yes, of course, maybe oil and gas companies care about the tax credit or energy majors are part of the advocacy, but unless you're constantly reminding two committees in our Congress, the Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee, of the utility, the purpose, and the value of these tax credits, they can get traded on, and public policy within a presidential administration can sort of chip away at that, which is why I think that coalition that we talked about on the direct air capture hub side is equally vital and important on this side for 45Q reporting, but feel very, very confident about the path ahead, especially based off of what some of the advocacy in DC.
But just to put you on the spot, can you currently report for 45Q or not?
For 45Q, you can currently report. There was a safe harbor that was developed by the Treasury Department that went through the end of last year. That by last year, we're talking about 2025. Now in 2026, I'm going to have to clarify the status of that safe harbor. But basically, what you can have is that you can have a new framework that the Treasury Department is contemplating right now to make sure that updated requirements are issued. So the safe harbor was the framework up through now, and this next framework is coming out soon. But I could come back to you on more information about that.
Because you used to report to the EPA, then you couldn't anymore. Then there's been the Safe Harbor Act, and now the idea is to move it to Treasury, right?
Yeah,
long term.
That's right. My understanding, just to nerd out for a quick second, was that there are sort of comparisons across ISO 27914 and the current requirements under the GHGRP, subpart RR in particular. It basically means that in light of this repeal, we must do work to affirm what the Treasury Department did for a short period of time when it came to that safe harbor. And what that further means is that it proposes an updated, meaning the Treasury is proposing an updated reporting requirement for electing 45Q's tax credit that is not ensconced today. So just to be very clear, the update that we need and our industry needs is not ensconced today. And so the goal right now is to make sure that we, industry, trade groups like CCC, are able to convene that secondary conversation to push Treasury on forming a position. But there are kind of bridges from the EPA action to now, and then there is a proposal from now to get this Treasury action ironed out.
Now, you need to do some quite interesting twists and turns, when you have essentially an administration that with the EPA has said carbon dioxide is not really something we should care about, but at the same time you have a tax credit that pays you money to sequester it. But I'm glad to hear that you're finding those creative ways forward.
Well, I think that it's an interesting point. I mean, if you have a second to hover on this, this is why subnational and international and national action matters, right? Because I think, and I hate to keep going back to this, but I think it's a best-in-class example that hits home to EU listeners of this podcast. Stockholm Exergy's taking FID recently was based off of a lot of different credits, incentives, frameworks that worked for that project. Yeah, you have, right? Yeah, beautiful. So I think similarly, when you talk about the modern landscape of investor confidence in carbon management technologies, you're going to have to squint a bit in the United States, but you see strong glimmers of hope. There's significant action, which we can go into. I'll be high level now, in California underway.
That's the last thing I want to talk to you about. So we'll get there.
Significant action going on in DC with the Big Beautiful Bill to protect a key tax credit. Significant action by companies like ours to protect huge sums of money. We're talking about $500 million on the DAC upside. And then you pair that with significant action that we're, I'm knocking on wood here, but we're anticipating later this summer, depending on when listeners listen to this, summer of 2026 on the ETS, and significant action that continues to develop in Canada from the new Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, over there. So I don't want to say it's a perfect example for your podcast on the Exergy FID, but what it is you start to take a look at various carbon management incentives, tax credits, non-dilutive sources of capital, and that's where you get the ability for companies to build and scale. It's a little messy. It requires some acrobatics to sort of bend over to, but I want to be very clear. The actions of Washington, D.C. are not just about one man in the Oval Office. It is literally the story of a durable coalition where some are working with Treasury to get new rules to claim 45Q. Some are working with governors in certain states to block bad bills. Some are working with governors in other states to pass demand exercising bills. So this all comes together in a way where you have to squint, but it is very apparent that it's there.
Yeah, and I'm much more optimistic about the US than most people. Maybe because I talk to folks like yourself too much.
Yeah. What makes you optimistic? I'm curious. What makes you optimistic?
I mean, exactly what you said, right? I think people, because the initial Trump months felt very traumatic to this industry, some people were left with that feeling and missed what's been happening in the meantime. And actually, if as you said, if you layer these different developments on top of each other, it's actually not bad at all. And that leads me to the final one that I want to talk to you about, which is California and the Cap and Invest program. We've covered it in the past, and what we discussed there was essentially, for example, this pot of money, these 85 million that are coming out of the Cap and Invest program that can be invested into decarbonization technologies, including CDR every year. But I understand that there's much more happening than that. And so what are you excited about in California? Because I know that some people, again, are left with a sour taste because a lot of efforts have happened in the last years that didn't lead to the desired outcome in California, but other stuff exists, right? So yeah, give me kind of the brief on California.
Yeah, to be in carbon, I respect your optimism, Sebastian, because I think to be in carbon management, you have to be an optimist, but you also have to be real, right? And I think this is a story. What happened in California is one of pragmatism. So again, for your audience, while we were pushing our advocacy efforts in DC on protecting grant funding, we were having robust conversations in California about ways to sort of hedge against, the potential loss of funding,
Of course.
right? And so we over 3 or 4 years, many members of the carbon removal industry, including, our peers at Climeworks or Carbon Engineering or Charm, were a part of these advocacy efforts on various bills, right, Sebastian? I know you've covered this and thought about this in the past. One model was polluters should pay for additional cleanup and buy carbon removal. That got a lot of momentum and then it stalled. Another model was to think about like for like and whether we should codify that framework in California. It had a little bit of discourse and then it kind of fell apart for pitting pathways against each other. But the beauty of having different bills, even if they were tried and failed in California, is that in the last 3 or 4 years, California has had nearly 1/3, if not more than 1/3 of its whole legislative body changed over. New members of the Assembly, new members of the Senate. So each of these bills allowed us to educate members as to what the heck carbon removal is and why we need it. And you would think in green California that would be a given, but it's not. And education matters. Member by member, we were able to use our facility in the Central Valley of California to tour members from the left, from the middle, from the right, from environmental justice groups to labor unions. And why that's important, Sebastian, is last year, we had a moment in time, and Governor Newsom was working hard to make sure that he could extend our cap and trade program, our version of an ETS. And in that extension, there was AB 1207 and SB 840. On the second one, that was where we were worried, hey, if there are additional cuts from DC, not just for carbon removal, but for, low carbon concrete and building materials, for greener forms of hydrogen, for long energy duration storage, then certainly there should be a hedge against that. And that was the discussion with the governor, with labor unions like the building trades, with key members of our legislature to create a pot of money for that. That's the 85 that you mentioned. But in addition to that, there was a declaration from the legislature in statute, not just in a rule, not just in a plan, not just in a report, but in statute that said carbon dioxide removal must be integrated in the cap and trade program. So I know you mentioned different people have different takes on this, but let me tell you why this is incredibly consequential for the entire planet. First, that 85 million might sound small. Many of peers in the DAC industry may not even be able to build a facility based off of that if it's split into different fractions. But what it does is it allows us to have a conversation with the California Energy Commission, entities like the California Air Resources Board, to suggest that parts of that money should go to carbon removal to hit the state's net zero targets. And that's the discussion we're having right now. This work, budgetary allocations, just like the EIF knows, just like the EU Buyer Club knows, it takes a while, but we have a coalition of the willing asking our legislature to put more money in CDR, and we think that's good, irrespective of who ends up putting that money in their bank account. But what I think is even more fascinating is a parallel between what the EU is cooking up and what California is doing with that CDR integration. Here is where you say some of the biggest polluters right now are standing on their 2 feet firmly in the ground because there's a global debate on affordability. And if those polluters get to say that your rules in California or in Brussels are making things too expensive, they very quickly have a sympathetic ear in voters from continent to continent. Right. And so instead of putting a new kind of tax or a new compliance mechanism on the form of or on the backs of heavy emitters, it now said, if you're going to continue emitting above a certain amount, then those emissions on a ton for dollar basis can actually be used to comply with the overall coming down cap on emissions in the state by investing those dollars on a ton for dollar basis into carbon management facilities. That is a big deal because what that means is it pulls out the government from saying, you need to pay this, you need to pay that, and just instead gives the emitters some agency and says, okay, well, if we need to continue polluting here for this facility, well, the only way we can do that and get away with it is actually by investing in companies like Climeworks or like Heirloom or like Charm.
Investing or buying credits? What does it count?
Investing. Great clarifying question. So the way it's currently framed is covering project development capex. So the ability in California, yes, in California. So there will be a continued discussion this year over parameters of how that plays out. But our expectation is that the total addressable market from this is sized in the billions, and it allows companies that are heavy emitters to think about investing in the very technologies that need that upfront investment right now. Now, I want to say one thing because I'd be remiss if I didn't note this, Sebastian. There is a very important debate happening in California and will continue to happen as to whether this is the right way to allow those emitters to invest. And that is a good debate to be had. There are those in the environmental justice community that believe that the dollars where you mandate them not to give them more investment options, it should go towards allowances and offsets that raise revenue for the states, and those revenues can go out to different community groups. I don't want to minimize that because that $85 million that we cared about on the first example of what was good in California, that comes from revenues here, right? So those are important debates to be had. But what you and I know is in the last 4 or 5 years, climate policy is not just about climate policy. It's about FID policy. How do you hit FID? And unless you're able to have projects that can put steel on the ground, have debt, and have a capital stack that get it up and running, you don't have any path to hitting removals targets. And I think that's a very real concern. The only critical path that I see is those companies that maybe have lower capex approaches to CDR, which there are many, and that's great. We see a lot of bikers companies taking FID in the Nordic states, for example, or other examples of companies are those that have other balance sheets for other products so they can co-invest or cross-invest into technologies like direct air capture. But we need 10 billion tons, as you know better than I, Sebastian, removed annually. And to do that, you're going to need to give these emitters more options to push their dollars this place. So I think this is a both and moment where you can both think about removing credits and investing in technologies, not an either or.
Excellent. I have to cut you off there because we're up on time. But I'm sure there will be a follow-up at some point, especially on this program, because I think it's very interesting and we only scratched the surface of it.
You're totally right. And if I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that my colleague, who I know you know well, Christian, is an incredible thinker on this as well. So I hope you have him on the podcast to kind of unpack the specifics of MDI.
Next time we'll have Christian on the show for that. All right. Thank you so much, Vikrum. Thank you for shedding light on a tour of the US today.
Absolutely. Take care.
You too.